Okay, well, I'm very delighted to join you here today at Knights Templar School. It's a great honour to join you, and today I'm going to be talking about how I began my human rights campaigning. Partly just to inform you, but also I hope maybe even inspire you, to give you a sense that you don't have to be special or extraordinary to do special, extraordinary things. I began my campaigning way back in 1967 in my hometown of Melbourne, Australia, at the age of 15. Nothing in my family prepared me for the human rights campaigner I've become. Everything about my family was an influence against being a campaigner, against taking a stand. So for me, it is almost implausible that I should have ended up becoming a human rights campaigner and having done this human rights work now for a total of 48 years. I've been doing this for nearly half a century from the age of 15. But nothing in my background inclined me towards being a human rights campaigner. So my conclusion from this is, if I can, anyone can. And you may not wish to be a human rights campaigner, but whatever you would like to be, whatever you aspire to be, from my experience, I think you can do it. I was born in Melbourne, Australia in 1952. I grew up in a period with a very illiberal right-wing government where there were extreme anti-communist sentiments. You've probably all heard of McCarthyism in the United States. Australia had its own version. Anybody with liberal, progressive values was denounced as a communist. And I was, because I took a stand against some of the things that the government said and did. My own parents were very devout, ultra-conservative, evangelical Christians. I'd say they were borderline Christian fundamentalists. If any of you have read a book by Jeanette Winterson called Oranges Are the Only Fruit, and she came from a very extreme Christian background, very, very similar to mine. On the positive side, the thing my parents did teach me was the importance of doing the right thing, standing up for what you believe to be right. My parents always said, don't follow the mob, don't just copy what everybody else does, think for yourself, do the right thing. You have to take personal responsibility for your life. Don't leave it to others. Don't say, because the school says this or because someone else says that, it's right. Question it and do what you believe to be right. Follow your conscience. And that's really stuck with me. It stuck with me all these years. I don't claim to always be right. I may be wrong, I may be right. But the important thing is, I follow my conscience and do what I believe to be right. I listen to my critics, I listen to alternative points of view, and then I reconsider what I think and do. My father, Gordon, worked in an engineering factory. He was a lathe operator. My mother worked some of the time in a biscuit factory, and the rest of the time she spent as a housewife and caring for us kids. But sadly, she suffered from chronic, life-threatening asthma. Very severe asthma attacks that almost killed her. And there were many, many times during my childhood when she nearly died. At the time, there was no National Health Service in Australia. It was private medicine. So a lot of our family income went on medical care and hospital treatment for my mother. And that made us very poor. It was a very tough childhood. I can remember coming home from school at times when there was no food in the house. I was hungry. I'd been playing football or whatever, I was hungry, there was no food in the house. So life was tough. And of course, because my mother was so ill, it fell to me as the eldest child to run the household. You know, my father was out at work, I had to run the household. From about the age of 8, I took on that responsibility. I looked after my younger brothers and sisters. I did the cooking, the cleaning, the sewing, the washing, all those things. So I'd come home from school and do those tasks. It meant I didn't have much fun with playtime a lot of the time. You know, I had to say goodbye to my friends who wanted to go off and play sport or do something, and I had to go back and do all the household chores. But the one thing I'd say that was very positive out of that experience was that it made me very resourceful, it made me very independent. From an early age, I was able to look after myself, as well, of course, my younger brothers and sisters. I was born, as I said, in 1952, just a few years after the end of the Second World War. Nearly, well, I wouldn't say nearly all, but a lot of the comic books, films, and books and other things that I saw as a child had war themes. You know, the war was very much in my mind as a child. You know, you go to local newsagents and buy a comic, and it was, you know, often about the war. If you went to the cinema, there'd often be films about the war. In the newspaper, there'd be sort of features and commentaries about the war. So it had a very big impact on me. And so I think from about the age of 11 or so, I began to ask my parents and other adults, why did people allow Hitler come to power? Why didn't they stop him? No one gave me a satisfactory answer. I thought as an 11-year-old, if he'd been stopped right at the beginning, maybe the Second World War wouldn't have happened. So my conclusion from all that was that when I grew up, if ever I saw tyranny and repression and injustice, I wouldn't be silent. I wouldn't do nothing. I wouldn't look the other way or walk on the other side of the street. I want to try and do something to make sure there were no more Hitlers in the future. Then in 1963, a bit later, when I was still 11 years old, I saw reports about the racist bombing of a black church in Birmingham, Alabama, in the United States. 4 young girls about my own age were murdered. That made me a lifelong anti-racist. Because as 11 years of age, I thought to myself, how could anyone kill another human being, let alone 4 young girls in a church on Sunday morning? So that generated an interest on my part in Dr. Martin Luther King and the Black Civil Rights Movement. I could see at the age of 11 that they were fighting a just fight. And my hopes were with them that they would win to overturn the racism that then existed in the southern United States. In those days, of course, there were severe restrictions on black people voting in elections, and large parts of the Deep South were segregated. There were separate beaches, parks, drinking fountains for black people and white people. It was like apartheid South Africa in the United States until the early 1960s. The next big event that was influential was in 1967, in the state of Victoria. Melbourne is the capital of the state of Victoria in Australia. In Victoria, there was still the death penalty, so criminals could be hanged for serious crimes. In 1967, I was 15 years old, and a man was due to be hanged. His name was Ronald Ryan. He'd allegedly shot dead a prison warder during an escape. But I worked out, reading a summary of the autopsy report in a local newspaper, I worked out that it would have been almost physically impossible for Ronald Ryan to have fired the fatal shot. He was standing over there. The warder was chasing him. He allegedly turned around and shot the warder dead. But the trajectory of the bullet through the warder's body meant that that would have been almost physically impossible. Nevertheless, Ronald Ryan was hanged. Despite that reasonable doubt, he was hanged. I was appalled. Up until that time, I guess I'd taken the view that, the government is there to serve the people. The government is there to act on our behalf and protect us. But when this man was hanged, it provoked a lifelong skepticism of authority. I began to think to myself, I can't trust the government. I can't trust the police. I can't trust the judges. They allowed a man to hang when there was at least a reasonable doubt that he fired the fatal shot. Indeed, many years later, there was a commission of inquiry which came to exactly the same conclusion. It would have been almost impossible for Ronald Ryan to have fired that fatal shot. And indeed, there was testimony from other eyewitnesses and even other warders at the prison, which likewise suggested that Ryan had not fired the fatal shot, but that it was quite likely that the fatal shot had been fired accidentally by another warder. That the prison warder who died had been caught in crossfire. So that experience made me skeptical of authority. It opened my eyes to other injustices, because I thought, if the government could do this, in this particular case, where this man was hanged, what else are they doing that's not right? So I began to investigate and question the treatment of the Indigenous Black Australians, the Aboriginal people. And I was appalled to learn the history of how they'd been dispossessed of their land. They'd been forced off their land. Their land had been seized by white settlers from Britain, mostly. I also began to question Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War alongside the Americans. At this stage, the Australians, Americans, New Zealanders, South Koreans, and a few other nations were fighting a war in Vietnam. A war that had been precipitated by the refusal of the United States to allow free and genuine elections in 1954 because the United States feared that the communists would win the elections. So I looked and examined, what Australian and American soldiers were doing. I discovered the horrendous human rights abuses, the massacres of innocent villagers, the blanket bombing of civilian areas, the torture of political prisoners in the regime's prison camps, which were backed by the Americans. At school, I was something of a rebel. I thought, well, I've got all these ideas about changing things. How about starting at school? So I got to go with some other pupils, and we demanded and won the right for pupils to have a say in the running of our school. So we set up a Students' Representative Council, and we made demands to the head teacher and the teaching staff and to the parents that we wanted X, Y, and Z things to change. Some of them were very simple, basic things like, the kind of food that was stocked in the school canteen. Other things were about the right to have a school magazine, which we could write freely without censorship. And it all culminated on the 4th of July, American Independence Day in 1968, when a group of us pupils burnt the American flag in the school playground in protest of the American war in Vietnam. For all these things, I was strongly criticized by the headmaster, who was quite conservative. I began with other pupils to campaign to raise funds to provide scholarships for Aboriginal children. Most Aboriginal kids left school at the minimum school leaving age because their parents needed them to go out to work. So a group of us hit on the idea of creating a fund to give scholarships to Aboriginal kids so they could stay on at school, get qualifications, become skilled professionals, and also not only help themselves, but their families and communities as well. And that scholarship scheme is still going to this very day, and it's helped many, many, many Aboriginal kids get an education which they otherwise would not have done. At school, I wasn't aware that I was gay. You know, I liked girls, I dated girls. I had very good legs. Some of the boys in the school used to wolf whistle me. They did make jokes. Sometimes I was called Poofter Pete or Pansy Pete. But I was very confident in my heterosexuality, so it didn't matter to me. I just thought this was just a silly joke, and I laughed with them. It wasn't nasty or vicious, but it was a homophobic jibe, really. As I said, it didn't really upset me because I was confident that I was straight, or so I thought. Despite these jibes, I was the most popular boy in the school. One of the demands we had in our school was for the pupils to elect the prefects and the school captain. And previously, in most schools, it had always been appointed by the headmaster. Well, we were on the right to elect the prefects and head boy and head girl. And in 1968, I was voted by the other pupils as head boy. So, despite the illusion or the suspicion that I was gay, I was very popular and won that great honour. That year, at the end of that year, 1968, at the age of 16, I had to leave school to get a job. Because like the Aboriginal kids, because of the poverty of my family, they needed me to go out and earn a living and to make money and to contribute to the family finances. My first passion was art and design. I wanted to be an architect or a theatre designer or something like that. But of course, I had no qualifications. My parents couldn't afford to send me to university. It was very expensive in those days to go to university in Australia. So what I did was, I got a job in a display and design department of one of Melbourne's biggest department stores. So I began learning on the job to doing sign writing, windows, interiors, logos, things like that. So I was taught by senior staff. I was sort of like an apprentice, so I learned on the job. And that's where I first met other gay people. When I first went there, I still thought I was straight, but I met other gay people working in this department store and realised that they were not the monsters I'd been led to believe. They were young people my own age, they were very nice people, talented people, they were good company, fun to be with. And over a number of months, it sort of began to dawn on me, maybe I am gay. So at the age of 17, I met someone who happened to work at the same store and fell in love. And we moved in together and began a relationship. And although we're no longer together, we are still lifelong best friends and regularly see and speak to each other. That same year, late 1969, I read a report in, I think it was a local newspaper in Melbourne, about a gay rights protest in New York. And I immediately thought to myself, well, I campaigned against the death penalty to try and save Ronald Ryan. I campaigned to get scholarships for Aboriginal kids. I campaigned against Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War. Now it's time to campaign for something that affects me directly, namely my gayness. So I decided I wanted to be part of this fight for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender equality. The problem was, in Melbourne at the time, homosexuality was still totally illegal. You could be sentenced to several years' imprisonment and enforced psychiatric treatment. There were no gay organisations, no helplines, no counselling services, nothing. Just a couple of seedy bars. There weren't any gay nightclubs. Nothing. So I remember asking friends, gay friends, let's do something. Let's organise a campaign. Let's set up an organisation to campaign for gay rights. They looked at me like I was crazy. They said, go away. What do you know? You're only 17 years old. You'll get us all arrested. Just leave us alone. So I was quite despairing that other people didn't feel the same passion as I did. That here we could be put in prison. We could be subjected to forced psychiatric treatment. And they weren't doing anything. So all I felt I could do was write letters to local newspapers, to the main newspapers in the state of Victoria. So whenever there was a homophobic story in the newspaper or an issue that I felt strongly about, I'd write a letter to the editor of the newspapers. Initially, of course, I was too scared to sign my name, let alone give my address. But gradually, over time, I did sign my name and give my address. But I can tell you I was very, very nervous. I was half expecting a policeman to knock on the door and getting arrested. I suppose that I began to think back to the Black Civil Rights struggle. And I concluded in my own sort of simplistic way that gay people were an oppressed minority, just like black people in America. And that the black civil rights tactics of non-violent direct action and civil disobedience could also be applied to the struggle for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender freedom. So I began that early activism just letter writing. It wasn't very satisfying, but I thought at least I'm doing something. I also thought at the time, looking at the example of the Black Civil Rights Movement, it would probably take about 50 years to win legal equality in countries like Australia, Britain, and the United States. And that's more or less how it's turned out. We haven't quite got full legal equality in Britain, although we're very, very close, and it has taken about 50 years. As I mentioned at the time, Australia was fighting alongside the Americans in Vietnam. I believed that war was unjust, immoral, and I wasn't prepared to serve. I wasn't even prepared to register for national service, which was a legal requirement. The penalty of refusal was 2 years jail. If I'd stayed in Australia and continued to refuse, I could have faced 2 years imprisonment for not going to the army and not fighting in Vietnam. So I decided to skip the country and I came to London in 1971. The second day I was here, I saw a little sticker on a lamppost near Oxford Circus, which advertised the meetings of the newly formed Gay Liberation Front. 5 days later, I was at my first meeting, and within a month, I was helping to organise some of the big protests organised by the GLF. Modelled on the methods of the Black Civil Rights Movement, we organised sit-ins at pubs that refused to serve gay, lesbian, bisexual and transgender people. And we successfully forced the pub owners to back down. Little did I imagine that just a few years ago in London, 2 gay men would be thrown out of a pub in London for merely kissing. So it shows that you can win a battle one year, but the next year or many years later, sometimes you have to refight those battles. Anyway, in the Gay Liberation Front, we did lots of spectacular things. We saw ourselves as championing not just the rights of gay and lesbian people, but standing with all people who suffered injustice. So we stood together with the black community, fighting racism. We stood together with the women's liberation movement, fighting against sexism. We had this vision of a new and better society for everyone, that LGBT people were part of a broader movement to secure freedom and equality for everyone. My inspirations have been many, but I guess The key ones are people like Alejandro Scandi, Sylvia Pankhurst, Martin Luther King, and to some extent, Malcolm X and Rosa Luxemburg. What I've done is take some of their ideas and some of their methods and adapt them to the contemporary struggle for human rights and LGBT rights. Most of my focus is on campaigns for LGBT rights, but I also do lots of work supporting democracy and human rights movements in other countries on other issues. So we support the struggle for human rights and democracy in Russia, Pakistan, Uganda, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and many other countries. Because their struggle for freedom is the same as ours. They want the same rights, the same freedoms, the same choices, the same options. And of course, in these countries, there is much, much greater repression. So those activists there are extraordinarily brave. They're taking great personal risks. Risk of imprisonment, risk of torture, even risk of being killed. For me, it is always important to stand together with those who are fighting for human rights and democracy. Some of you will be aware of some of the things I've done over the years, and I'll just perhaps briefly mention one or two. In 1998, I was part of the LGBT direct action human rights group Outrage, and we interrupted the Easter sermon of the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. George Carey, on Easter Sunday in his cathedral. Now, we did not do that just for the heck of it. We didn't do it as a first resort, we did it as a last resort. For 8 years, Dr. Carey had refused to meet not only us in Outrage, but any LGBT campaigners. He wouldn't even meet with members of the lesbian and gay Christian movement, many of whom belonged to the Church of England. So, faced with his refusal to meet, we decided to go to his cathedral and challenge him in public on Easter Sunday. Now, we did not disrupt the sacred parts of the service. We waited until he began his sermon, and then we calmly walked up out of our seats and walked into the pulpit. My colleagues held up placards criticising the anti-gay stance of the Archbishop. He was against legal equality for gay people. He said the law should, in certain circumstances, discriminate because, in his view, homosexuality and heterosexuality were not equivalent. And then, while they held up the placards, I delivered a short alternative sermon. We didn't insult or criticise the Christian faith or the Archbishop. I simply made the point that the Archbishop was supporting discrimination in law. He was endorsing discrimination against other human beings with damaging consequences for those people. And that, in my view, discrimination is not a Christian value. There's nothing in the Bible, or for that matter the Torah or the Quran or any other holy book, which justifies discrimination. Unfortunately for me and my colleagues, being Easter Sunday, in the front row were all the civic dignitaries, the mayor and the leading councillors, the head of the ambulance service, the fire service, and the police service. So the chief constable and senior officers were there. They got out of their seats and then came around to the pulpit and proceeded to arrest us. Of course, they were doing this while I was at the pulpit, and I was holding on to the front of the pulpit and speaking. Then suddenly I had these two gigantic arms come around my waist and give me a yank and pulled me away from the pulpit, but I was holding on to the pulpit, so part of this ancient pulpit came off in my hand. Anyway, I was arrested and then taken to Canterbury Police Station, where I spent about the next 6 hours or so. I was eventually bailed, but required to turn back to court some weeks later, where I was facing prosecution under the Ecclesiastical Courts Jurisdiction Act of 1860, formerly part of the Brawling Act, I think of 1551 or 1552. Under that law, any kind of protest in a church, no matter how brief and peaceful, is unlawful. So at the trial, the judge accepted that I'd been polite, that I hadn't insulted or abused anybody. He said it was all over in a matter of a couple of minutes, but he said, this law is very clear. If you interrupt a minister of religion in a place of worship, you are committing an offence. So he could have fined me £5,000 and given me a 6-month prison sentence. Instead, he fined me £18.60, his comical allusion to the 1860 Act under which I'd been charged and convicted. The upshot of that protest was that Dr. George Carey was very, very embarrassed, because we made the point that we'd been trying to meet him for 8 years and he wouldn't. And as a result, because he was so embarrassed, he did finally agree to meet the lesbian and gay Christian movement for the first time. He also set up a senior bishop to begin a dialogue with the wider LGBT community. That had never happened before. He also didn't stop, but dramatically reduced his public statements attacking the gay community and gay rights. So we feel that that action was quite provocative and controversial, but necessary and successful. It did get a result. Another instance, which you've probably heard of, was the attempted citizen's arrest of President Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe. In late 1999, I got a phone call at almost midnight. And the caller spoke in a thick African accent. He said, "You may be interested to know that President Mugabe has arrived in London for a private shopping trip. He's staying at the St James's Court Hotel near Victoria. He'll be flying back to Zimbabwe from Heathrow Airport at 6 p.m. on Saturday night." Before I could ask any question, the caller hung up. I thought to myself, is this a hoax, a joke? I decided to assume it was true. So the next morning, I thought, I'm going to try and get Mugabe arrested. Only I know if I go to the police, they'll probably say no. So I'm going to use the power of citizen's arrest to try and get him arrested. Now, under British law, any private citizen, if you know and have evidence that a person has committed a crime, you have a lawful right to arrest that person, but then you must inform the police and hand him or her to the officers. So that was my sort of thinking. I had evidence that President Mugabe had condoned the torture of 2 black journalists in Harare, Zimbabwe, Raychoto and Mark Chavaduka. So that morning, I went to Amnesty International and I got all the information about the torture of those journalists. And I got the evidence where President Mugabe had said they'd got what they deserved and were lucky to not suffer more. His statements clearly indicated that he was aware of their torture and that he approved of it. Under both international and British law, anybody who's a state official, a government official, who condones or authorises, acquiesces or colludes with acts of torture anywhere in the world can be arrested and put on trial. So that was my legal case. I was going to use the power of citizen's arrest to arrest him under Britain's anti-torture law for those crimes committed in Zimbabwe. The question was, I couldn't do a citizen's arrest alone, I needed some help. I phoned loads and loads of people. Everybody had plausible excuses. The only people who I found who were willing were members of the LGBT group Outrage. Although President Mugabe is homophobic, we weren't doing it because of his homophobia, we were doing it because we objected to his acquiescence and collusion in acts of unlawful torture. Anyway, what happened was, on the Saturday morning, we arrived really early outside the hotel, assuming you wouldn't leave too early in the morning. We arrived at 8:30 in the morning with a photographer, a journalist, and a video person to record what we were doing, partly to protect us against false allegations, in case the police tried to frame us, and partly just to let the world know what we're going to do and what we hopefully will achieve. It was a freezing cold morning. We waited 2 hours. We were trying to look inconspicuous, which is very difficult. So one guy was in a phone box pretending to make phone calls. Another one was at a bus stop reading a newspaper. I was looking in shop windows. But hey, you know, after 2 hours, the concierge, the guy in the top hat and tails, who greets the guests who arrive at the hotel, he'd obviously noticed that we'd been there. I mean, one guy standing at a bus stop reading a newspaper for 2 hours, that's a bit implausible, isn't it? So anyway, he started looking at us and, you know, I began to get quite nervous. You know, in this situation, I'd done these kind of things hundreds of times, but, you know, my body temperature dropped, I began to shiver, my stomach was churning over, I had a splitting headache from all the nervous tension and anxiety. Had an urgent need to pee, because when you're very nervous, you're more inclined to pee. But I'd been holding it in, but I reached where I couldn't. Then I knew if I went to the toilet, that would probably be the moment he came out and then we'd miss him. So what I did was, I had a copy of the Evening Standard, which I was supposedly reading. I folded it up into a cone-type shape and stood discreetly in a shop, a store that was closed. I stood in the doorway and gently peed into the coned paper and then put it in the rubbish bin. Fortunately, I did that because literally about 7 minutes later, out came President Mugabe from the vehicle entrance. I scratched the top of my head to indicate that it was him in the car, and my colleagues, my 3 colleagues from Outrage, very bravely ran straight in front of his speeding limousine. It screeched to a halt about 6 to 9 inches from their legs. Then one ran behind the car, so it couldn't drive forward and couldn't drive backward. I ran from the side and opened the rear door. Astonishingly, it was unlocked. And there before me in the back seat was President Mugabe. I gently took him with this hand. I held his hand with this hand, and then held out this hand with an open palm to show I didn't have a weapon. I said to President Mugabe, "You are under arrest on charges of torture. Torture is a crime under international law. I am now summoning the police." You should have seen the look on his face. You know, his eyes popped, his jaw dropped. He recoiled back in his seat and put up his hands. He looked like a frightened 10-year-old boy. He is very, very dark-skinned, but you could see a visible ashen pallor across his face. I think he thought he was going to be killed. To which I thought, now you know what your victims feel like, only we aren't going to kill you, we're going to take you to a court of law, and you will have a chance to defend yourself. So we then summoned the police. Initially only 3 officers arrived, and there were 4 of us. So it took 2 officers to remove each person. So they took one of my colleagues from away from the front of the car and put him on the pavement. And then they went back to get the next person. But of course my colleague who was put on the pavement then just ran back in front of the car again. So there was this cat and mouse game going on for about 5 or 10 minutes until reinforcements arrived. About 20 officers turned up, and we were summarily arrested while President Mugabe was given a police escort to go Christmas shopping at Harrods. We spent the next 6 hours in Belgravia police station while they decided to just make a decision about what to charge us with. They weren't interested in the allegations of torture, even though we had the legal case and the legal evidence. The police were not interested. They were just concerned about prosecuting us, and they were threatening us with a whole list of charges. Assaulting a police officer, criminal damage, obstructing the highway, behaviour likely to cause a breach of the peace, and so on and so on. All untrue. We never damaged anything, we never harmed anyone, we were non-violent, peaceful. Anyway, the upshot of it was that on the opening day of our trial, the police and the prosecution got together and decided to withdraw all the charges. I can only speculate as to why. I think the main reason was because we let it be known that everything we'd done had been filmed, because we had our film crew with us. We had the film crew, and we could show we did not assault the police, we did not cause any criminal damage, we didn't use any profanities, we didn't do any of the things they were claiming. Plus, I think, they didn't want it tested in a court of law that we had acted lawfully, that we had acted in accordance with the power of citizen's arrest to uphold Britain's anti-torture law. They thought if we won our case, it would give encouragement to others to try the same kind of tactic. That's, I think, the reason why we were not proceeded with. The upshot of that protest was that it made headlines all around the world. You know, seizing a president in the street is pretty exceptional. But of course, that was not the main purpose. We wanted him arrested and put on trial, which we did not succeed. But we also wanted to publicise his human rights abuses, to let the world know what was happening in Zimbabwe, because at this time, the human rights abuses by the Mugabe regime were very little reported, hardly reported at all. And as a result of what we did, they were reported. Perhaps not as much as we would have liked, but they were reported much more than they had been in the past. The other good thing about it was that in the weeks afterwards, I received about 5,000 emails from people in Zimbabwe. And this was in 1999, when email was not that popular. And they nearly all said the same thing. Thank heaven someone knows and cares about what is happening in our country. We thought the world didn't know and didn't care. We felt neglected, ignored, betrayed. But you have put this issue to the attention of the world. So psychologically and emotionally, it was a huge boost to people in Zimbabwe to think that their president had been seized in the street and held to account, at least morally and intellectually, for the crimes of his regime. So it gave them a great deal of sense of hope that people in the outside world knew and cared. So my final point is to go back to my starting point. Nothing in my background prepared me to do any of these things. You too can do extraordinary things. Whatever you decide to do with your life, aim high. Desire and seek and pursue that which is your dream. And don't believe that perhaps because you come from a humble background that you can't succeed. You can. You just have to have the confidence, the determination, the patience to make it happen. My final thought is, my motto is, don't accept the world as it is, dream of what the world could be, and then help make it happen. Thank you.